If you have a question you'd like to put to any one of our panellists, please, if you wouldn't mind, just raise your hands. The microphone will be delivered to you.
Bruce Rasmussen, Victoria University. The FTA with China has prospects of increasing exports of services, and we haven't talked much about services at lunchtime. And we have very strong demand for services out of China, but supply out of Australia is very limited, other than in education and maybe the way we count tourism. So I was wondering from the panel, and I guess I was thinking mostly of Peter McGregor, how does he see the prospects for services out of the FTA?
Look, it's a really good question because services, I think, do tend to be a little overlooked in the discussion around this. When I think about the China FTA in particular, and you think of the various categories, of goods and services wrapped up in it, it's clearly, I think, mildly positive for the natural resources sector, with some reduction in tariffs on coal and energy in particular. As I've already talked about, it's very positive for certain elements of the agri sector. It's certainly positive for pharmaceuticals and health products. And then you've got the question of services, and the reason I think services are a little harder to get your head around is there's not the quantifiable reduction in tariffs that apply to the export of goods. It's about access. And it's a little hard to get your head around what access actually means. Clearly, across a whole range, whether it's education, financial services, the legal profession, engineering, all of those professional services, there are very, very strong statements of increased market access and strong policies around increased market access included in the free trade agreement. And at the risk of ducking the question, I might actually pass the question down to my two colleagues, Peter and Tracey, who are more in the services industry, and get their perspective, because I think it's a really, really good question, but much, much tougher to quantify. And it may well be the big sleeper in the China FTA. It may, the big beneficiaries ultimately may actually be in services as opposed to exported goods. Sorry to handball that one to you.
I mean, today we have a business that's in part, we have a small offshoot of our business that's in China, and certainly I wouldn't see that we suffer today from limitations of that. More the limitations are the nature of the market and the competitive dynamic within the market for us. But I think, rightly, given the quantum of what services contribute to our own economy, there's no reason to say it's not the same in the Chinese economy, and therefore, but I think the difference is the scale. Services are either IP businesses like ourselves, you build it and you can get scale, or it's people businesses, and then we're sort of dwarfed. So we have an offshoot of our own development that's in China, as I said, because of the skills issue. So I think the difference is the scale, and unless it's something to do with an IP, what are you taking to them?
Export of education services to China is already huge, of course, and is projected to grow very strongly. I don't think particularly because of the free trade agreement, but and certainly, Chinese students coming to Australia is already very large. It's projected to grow further. I think where access is a bigger issue, of course, is doing things offshore in China, which we've already been doing in quite substantial amounts. In some ways, that doesn't look like it's going to get any easier, because if you're not already in there working with a Chinese university, it looks like you're probably not going to get much more access. I think they're not intending to expand opportunities for universities operating in China much beyond those that are already there. But there may be more opportunities emerging in the sort of the private sector in doing things not just with the university sector in China, but doing things with other providers, maybe with industry and so on. But huge potential. It's a very successful industry already, and I expect it to grow very strongly in the future.
Perhaps add to that, the opportunity that we see in the services space flowing from the signing of chapter is in healthcare in particular. So just to frame the opportunity, the number of 65-year-olds and above in China is expected to treble between 2010 and 2050. So there's an enormous demand opportunity in China. The age dependency rate in China is increasing very rapidly. You've got rising wealth, you've got a rising middle class, you've also got a healthcare policy in China which is becoming much more supportive of spending on health. Currently, they only spend 5.5% of their GDP on health. So the demand side of the equation looks particularly promising. One of the things that did come out of chapter is to enable Australian companies, Australian-owned companies, to establish hospitals and aged care facilities in China. And just last week, we saw, or I read an article in the Fairfax News that Ramsay had signed a JV agreement with Jinhan Hospital Group. So no doubt chapter will be a contributing factor which will encourage further investment by Australian companies into a space which dwarfs the opportunity here in Australia.
Thank you. Philip O'Brien, Darebin City Council. Question for Tracey. You've spoken a few times about the skills gap. I wanted to just ask you if you could be a bit more specific about the skills you're actually referring to, and why do you think there is such a gap here, and why is it not being met?
Sure. So for us, it's technology. We have a team of 200, between 250 and 300 developers. So it's computer graduates, computer science, computer engineering graduates. It's a much talked about STEM overall. So science, engineering is an area that for whatever reason is not seen as appealing to Australian students. While there is some modest increases, nowhere near at the quantum that the roles that are being created are. So it's everything from design skills to actual coding skills. And from there's just not enough graduates coming out of school with those skills. We take graduates, we take people who are experienced. The Chinese universities, these are areas or careers that are seen as very desirable. So in China, the universities have been able to scale very quickly. And so we're able to get 100 developers in China turned on very easily through a partnership that we have there. For us to find 5 designers, UX designers, what the website looks like, what our app looks like, that's months of work. And we're a well-recognized brand. We're a recognized employer of choice. It's exciting, interesting work that people like to do. We pay well, so there's nothing, so it's just supply and demand. Demand far exceeds supply. And so if you have children, especially of girls, make sure they do technology at school.
Rohini Kapadath from Pitcher Partners. My question is really about the topic of today, which is global networks transforming how Australia does business. I think too often the FTA discussion tends to overshadow the real discussion that we need to be having, and that I think SMEs would find more meaningful, which is around really the nuanced strategies that they need to adopt in these markets, and really how are we actually planning to transform how Australia does business. I'd love for the panel to share some examples, beyond, I guess, some of the more obvious ones like composition of our boards, building our collaborative capacity, accessing global supply chains. But I'd like to hear some examples of how we plan to transform Australian businesses.
It was such a big question, it floored the panel. So, I've been at the company, I've been at REA for just over a year, and we've done 2 fairly major acquisitions. One we're completing on Monday, or we announced on Monday last week that we're doing. And the reason I start with that is because one of the things I think is the appetite for Australian businesses to go overseas. I think it's a very culturally, the company that we're partnering / acquiring now is in 5 different countries. So I think for Australian businesses, and we're a reasonably sized business, to then move culturally, business environment, skills, the dynamics, the relation, they're all very, very different things. But I think there is definitely a risk appetite that Australians aren't necessarily as comfortable going overseas and expanding in those new markets versus a more certain outcome in staying here at home. And there are great examples of companies that have done it in the space I'm in. Seek and Car Sales are 2 companies that have been very successful. We're in parts of Europe already. But I think you have to build scale and recognize that actually going into other countries is starting something quite different. Everything that you've done here doesn't immediately transfer, and be very clear about what you bring to those other countries and what you have to buy, what you bring and what you buy. And so I think it is a level of risk appetite and the entrepreneurial spirit to go and do those things. And I think there is something culturally that it's not yet, Australians are not yet as comfortable to do that. Whether it's an entrepreneurial spirit or something else, I'm not sure. Having said that, there's 2 great examples in my own space, Car Sales and Seek, and ourselves. We're in 2 countries in Europe, and now we're in the US and Asia.
Well, I just say that I think the education system, schools and universities and TAFEs all have an important part to play to help try and transform the culture. And I think actually there's a risk that education institutions, if anything, might have an opposite effect on the culture with traditional education methodologies of teaching people how things are done instead of them learning how to create opportunities for themselves. And so we have to transform the school system, we have to transform the tertiary system to create and encourage a much more entrepreneurial spirit. And also, in terms of global entrepreneurship, a much more global outlook in our students. I think it's beginning to happen, but I think we've got to put the pedal down hard. We're committed to doing that at Victoria University, but I think the whole system needs to engage.
Maybe I'll just make a couple of comments from a Commonwealth Bank perspective about how we think of it, because I think we're an interesting case study in that we have, as I'm sure everyone in the room is aware, a very significant market share in Australia. We are one of the largest banks in the world. We're, I think, in the top 10 banks globally by market cap. And we're operating in a highly competitive market with 3 very large, well-resourced, well-run competitors in a country that's 2% of the world economy. So to continue to grow our business, we need to look offshore, but at the same time, we understand the fact that the reason we've been as successful as we have been is we've got a very long history of operating in this country and understanding exactly what our customers want. And by definition, that's an advantage you only have in your home country. So we think about it, and we've taken a slightly different view to some of our competitors, and I don't offer a judgment either way, but we've taken the view the sensible way for us to think about growth is to actually partner with both strategic partners. So we own stakes in 3 regional banks in China. We own a stake in quite a significant bank in Indonesia. We own a stake in a fintech company startup in South Africa. And it's about investing and backing those partners to build the business and in part to learn from them. And the other approach we take is to grow with our customers. That at the end of the day, we'll work to support our customers as they grow offshore. But it's a difficult question. It's a very good question, because at the end of the day, we need to sort of balance, continuing to deliver growth to our shareholders without materially changing the risk profile of our business in a market that's still a pretty small part of the world.
Andrew, perhaps access to finance, I think we were discussing over lunch.
Sure. So, firstly, exporting is more difficult than running a domestic business. So what we hear from our clients, believe it or not, they find roughly 40% of our clients will tell you that it's more difficult to do business in the US than Australia. Two comparative economies, and all it is the fact that it's foreign. It's different, the rules are different, the culture's different, so people find it harder to do business overseas than they do domestically, and therefore we should not be surprised to hear that banks find it harder to bank a business that wants to export than one that wants to produce domestically. So frequently the company obviously is exporting something, and all of a sudden the collateral that the bank has got security over could end up in China or in Kazakhstan or in Ghana. And Australia's repossession rate in those 3 countries is not very high. But the good news is, it's certainly under this government, we have refocused Efic on supporting small businesses, and we have good arrangements in place with all of the major banks. But to use CBA as an example, rather than saying to a client, we cannot help you export to Kazakhstan, what they'll do is they'll say, but we've got an arrangement with Efic and they will help you. So we wrote $112 million worth of business in the last 12 months, specifically for supporting small businesses that are going off to weird and wonderful places that I think legitimately Australia's banks would scratch their head and say, not with my money.
Okay. Look, sadly we've come to the end of question time. We always have a policy at CEDA of finishing right on 2 o'clock so that we can maintain the productivity of this great nation and getting you all back to work. Look, could I, in closing though, thank our 4 panellists. I think what they have drawn out from their contributions today were issues around questions associated with the risks, the financing, comparative advantage of industries, looking at the way in which the global supply chain can be integrated as part of their business, and importantly, how can an important question that came out of all of this was, how do we actually transform Australian businesses? What's the process of transforming Australian businesses? CEDA would argue, and if you go back and look at the major piece of report we did, in June of this year on the future of work, that this is a question that can no longer be put on the back burner. Australia is going to have to embrace the new industrial revolution that's not that far away. In fact, we're at the start of it now with the digital disruption that's taking place and the changes in technology and the growth of robotics and so on. Why that becomes important for Australia and why it becomes important for our trade relationships is more and more of these small businesses, at least what we've found in our reports, are going to have to embrace this new world order. They're going to have to embrace being involved in global supply chains. They're going to have to know where they can get financial support. They're going to have to know what skill levels that they have. They're going to have to know that if people come and train in Australia and go back to their own countries, that there will be a benefit because of alumni associations that have been developed. All of these are part of what CEDA has had some responsibility for developing over the last 12 months or so. And if you haven't seen that report on the future of work, I very much commend it to you. Again, it is on our website. However, would you please join me in thanking our 4 panellists for their contributions today.